everyone. Thanks for coming. Give you an idea of what our guest tonight is like, that he said, maybe we should all move over to the west side. Ego on the guy. No. Thank you all for being here. The Creighton Reading Series is a series of writers from the community and from around the country who come in regularly to share their work with us. The reading is sponsored by the Department of English and supported generously for many, many years by the College of Arts and Sciences, and we're very grateful for that support, especially when we can bring one of our own to the podium. David Philip Mullins started this year? This year? This year. Yeah, as a full-time tenure-track assistant professor in English, creative writing. And so it was a wonderful coincidence that his brand new book also had just been published, and we're here to celebrate that. David Mullins is a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop, whose fiction has appeared, frankly, all over the place. The Yale Review, the Massachusetts Review, Fiction, New England Review, Folio, Cimarron Review, Gulf Coast, Ecotone, and the anthology Just to Watch Him Die, Stories of Johnny Cash's Reno. Wouldn't you pay big money to get published in that book? Just to Watch Him Die, Stories of Johnny Cash's Reno. He's also the author of the just published collection of linked stories, Readings from Below, and I don't want to forget to mention that there are copies for sale at the back. More importantly, discount copies. You won't get that book for any less anywhere in the known universe, and an added benefit that will increase the collectible value of the book. I'll bet the author will sign up for it, so keep that in mind. Checks accepted. The collection was winner of the Mary McCarthy Prize in Short Fiction and the International Walter Scott Prize for Short Stories, and it was a finalist for both the Catherine Dakeless Nason Fiction Prize and the Hudson Prize. His story Driving Lessons won third prize in the Playboy College Fiction Contest, and his story Arboretum was a finalist for the Indiana Review Fiction Prize. Both stories, along with his story First Sight, were nominated for a Pushcart Prize, and First Sight was also listed as a notable Western Story of the Year in Best of the West New Stories from the West Side of the Missouri, as was his story This Life for the Next. Mullins has held the Dorothy and Granville Hicks Residency in Literature at Yaddo, the artist colony, and has been a recipient of the Stanley Elkins Scholarship from the Sewanee Writers Conference. He taught writing at the University of Iowa, the University of Nebraska, Omaha, before finding his true home here at Creighton, where, as I said, he teaches creative writing. Just a word about the book, and I'm not sure how to pronounce Nick's last name. Danzy. Nick Danzy is a troublemaker. He is a guy who trolls through the senior side of Las Vegas. You think there is a senior side, but no, I don't need to make bad jokes about Las Vegas. It's all senior. No. Trolls through the senior side of Las Vegas looking for whatever trouble he might find. And if this sounds like the material of a hard-boiled private eye novel, that's the feeling you get reading about him in Readings from Below. It's a feeling of danger and suspense, the kind of danger and suspense that involves human nature, human character, human fallibility. You get a sense that one more step over the line and he just might lose everything. Does this guy know how much trouble he's in? Nick's story involves, well, prostitutes, tacky massage parlors, addictions of various kind, but the collection and its main character is more than the details of its plot and setting. Like all good fictional characters, Nick Danzy is a walking contradiction. He's a guy who indulges every appetite, but then freaks out when he discovers his mother's strange addiction. He's a guy searching for love and for escape, though he's never quite able to tell which is which. In Nick Danzy, Mullins gives us a fearless portrayal of a character who may not win our sympathy, but who always wins our understanding. This brave and powerful book, which is lit by fading and flickering neon, sits squarely in the company of a couple of other books I have read and loved for many, many years, J.D. Salinger's Catcher in the Rye and John Updike's Rapid Run. So please help me welcome David Mullins.
I'd like to begin by thanking you, Brian, very much for that lovely introduction, especially for being compared to two of my favorite writers of all time, John Updike and J.D. Salinger. I'd also like to thank the English department for hosting this event, and all of you as well for attending. I really appreciate it. So, Greetings from Below is it's a novel in stories. The publisher labeled it simply stories, but when I wrote it, I really did intend it to be read as a novel in stories. So it's 9 stories that are all arranged chronologically. They all feature the same protagonist, Nick Danzy, whom Brent described. And that's really the only thing that links them, other than various supporting characters. They're all about him. They all kind of revolve around these several fixations that he has of a sexual nature. He's kind of a cad, and he's constantly cheating on his girlfriend Annie, who he's been with for a very long time, but he's not in love with her. So he loves her very much as a person, but has never actually fallen in love with her. So she's one of the principal characters in the book. Another character that you should know about before I start reading is Nick's mother, who Brent also mentioned. So she suffers from various addictions of her own, to gambling, shopping, smoking, and then ultimately in the book drinking pure cane sugar straight from the box, much the way an alcoholic would drink rubbing alcohol or something of that sort. And this is kind of her most severe addiction. The book really strongly hints that both Nick and his mother are experiencing he's experiencing his fixations, and she's experiencing her addictions in the wake of Nick's father's death. So in the very beginning of the book, his father dies, and their lives kind of spiral out of control after that. So they're both grieving. Nick's mother's probably grieving a lot more than he is. And so in his attempt to kind of try to save her or help her, he ends up getting kind of sucked into the underworld of the Las Vegas sex industry because of these fixations that he has. And then kind of looming as a ghostly presence behind all of this is Nick's dead father. And he crops up throughout the book several times in memories and in various expository passages. And then he's also in the first story and in the last story of the book. And so kind of bookends the stories in that sense. I think that's all you probably need to know to understand what I'm going to read. I guess one more thing I'll say is that all of the stories, each story is told in a different point of view and in a different tense. So the stories go back and forth between first and third, and then past and present. And I think that kind of distinguishes them as separate, autonomous short stories, and it makes the collection feel probably both like both a collection and a novel. So if you read it chronologically, it feels like a novel, but you can certainly read each story as a separate kind of self-contained thing. So the stories are quite long, so I usually don't read an entire story at a reading. What I'll probably do, just to kind of give you a taste of what the whole book is kind of about, is I think I'll read first one section from the beginning of the book, and then I'll skip to the middle, and then I'll skip to the end. So I'm going to read about 5 pages at a time, 15 pages total. You shouldn't have to be here for very long. Okay, so this story is called A Familiar Place. My mother thinks I tried to hit her during an argument we had earlier today, when I confronted her about living beyond her means. She tells me this in the men's department at Dillard's. I didn't know you had it in you, she says, to swing at a woman. She maneuvers between the sale racks in a loping stride. She could be a mall walker, a thief, her arms cutting the air as she makes her way through the crowded aisles. I do my best to keep up. She fingers a pair of gabardine trousers, a silk tie, a camel hair blazer. Let's get you some dress pants, she says. The price is right. But she's headed toward the sweaters, stacked plumb beyond the suits and topcoats. She's wrong, of course. I had no intention of hitting her, though I did get so upset that I put my fist through the living room wall. When I started to cry, she wrapped her arms around me and said, "What you need is a new sweater." It occurs to me that hurrying through a department store might be my mother's way of inhibiting herself from shopping, as if to linger would only encourage her habit. Not long ago, when she used to spend her free time practicing concertos on the violin, shopping was the sort of thing she considered a nuisance. Only in the 3 years since my father's death has she been making frequent trips to the mall, to the forum shops at Caesar's Palace, to the outlets at the south end of Las Vegas Boulevard. Takes your mind off things, she likes to say. The last time I was home, I found an American Express statement with a balance of $10,000 bookmarked in a J.C. Penney catalog. You wearing cardigans these days, Nikki? At the table of sweaters, my mother points to a pea green cardigan with navy blue buttons. No, I say, and I didn't even come close to hitting you. Note to self, she says, no cardigans. I'm not a violent person, so when I saw the hole in the living room wall, a flap of wallboard hanging like a tongue from when I pulled my fist back out, I had the presence of mind to acquiesce. All right, I said, as my mother held me in her arms, both of us winded from yelling. A new sweater it is. It's my second day home, 3 days before Thanksgiving, and already we've had 2 such arguments. Ear-splitting bouts of cursing and name-calling that have each ended with one of us in tears. It's not so much the shopping I'm worried about, but the amount of debt she's managed to accrue. Debt my mother has made no effort to repay. 3 or 4 other shoppers examine the sweaters at arm's length before a clerk gathers them up to be refolded. In the most cordial tone I can muster, careful not to set her off, I say, admit it, Mom, you're at it again. How much have you charged? You tried to hit me, she answers with a playful nudge. She shakes an index finger and smiles. And judging by what you did to the wall, you probably would have blackened my eye or broken my nose. In mock soreness, she thumbs the tip of her aquiline nose, batting her eyelashes in a manner that seems almost coquettish. I forgive you, of course. You're my only child. In fact, I forgive you, of course. You're my child. In fact, I'm her only child. A distinction that meant a boyhood of mollycoddling and scrutiny that lasted into my early 20s, until my father died and my mother turned most of her attention inward. Nowadays, it's rare that she's genuinely concerned with anyone's welfare but her own, and I take her desire to buy me something for what it is, a pretense. Christ, Mom, I say, stop being so dramatic, and don't change the subject. I hate that I lost my temper, that my anger turned destructive, because just last month I tried convincing her to have the walls painted, the carpet cleaned, the overgrown mesquites in the backyard pruned and staked, to make the place more marketable. Since my father's death, she's let it go. I told her she has no need for the 2 extra bedrooms, for a backyard that as a teenager used to take me half an hour to mow. I told her to sell the place. It's more than she can handle. Nonsense, she said, and changed the subject. We should be at the hardware store buying paint and spackle, I say now, my mother picking through a stack of wool roll necks. I suppose you've been smoking too. You'll need a large, she replies. Outside, rain pummels the roofs of automobiles, a loud, discordant drumming that I can hear through the glass doors that lead to the parking lot. I watch it fall, wondering what my father would think about us, about the distance between us, the turns our lives have taken, the resentment and misapprehension. Not that I haven't asked him. After he died, I began writing him secret notes, scribbled onto napkins and Post-its, which I keep dated in a manila envelope. What have we become, one reads. You can't put the toothpaste back in the tube, reads another, something my father used to say. My mother and I each have our own tacit ways of not letting go. I was the one who wanted to drive my father's old Buick, lime green with a rusted grill, to the mall today, but it's my mother who has it washed and vacuumed once a month. I'm as tall and lean as my father was in good health, and when I'm home I sometimes wear his Oxford shirts, which hang starched in my mother's closet, or his black wingtips, which she's kept polished to an impossible shine. She unfolds a cotton V-neck, burgundy with a thin white stripe across the middle. She fits it against my chest and arms, and it sticks there like a magnet. I tell her I've changed my mind. I have enough sweaters as it is. She gave me 2 this year for my birthday, both cashmere, from Saks Fifth Avenue. But my mother interrupts, waving her hand in the air like royalty. Don't be silly, she says. Where you live, you can never have too many. Mom, I say. What about yellow, she asks. She runs her fingers up a stack of mustard-colored crew necks. Mother. I peel the V-neck from my chest. Her eyes jump around in their sockets, revealing a medley of conflicting emotion, affection and outrage, desire and despair. Once a dark chestnut, her irises, it seems, have faded to a cataractous beige. Her clownish smile stretches the long lines of tension in her cheeks. What is it, she asks. Let's go home, I tell her. So that's the first scene of a familiar place. In the rest of that story, what ends up happening is that Nick's mother goes to work the next day, and he calls an old friend that he hasn't seen for a long time. They go hiking in the Nevada desert, and while they're hiking, Nick is bitten by a sidewinder. And so his friend rushes him to the emergency room. He ends up in the hospital. He ends up being just fine. He gets a dose of antivenom and he survives. And his mom, when he wakes up in the hospital, his mom is sitting there by him, and he notices that she's wearing this gold bracelet that he thought she had spent a lot of money on, and it turns out his father actually bought it for her as an anniversary gift. And it kind of brings back a lot of memories for Nick with his dad, and they end up driving back out to the desert where Nick was bitten by the snake in the middle of the night together, and they have this kind of moment of communion in the story. So the next passage or section that I'll read is from a story called This Life or the Next, and this is a kind of a pivotal point in the book. It represents, I guess, kind of the climactic point of the novel. In this story, Nick's mother is suffering from her sugar addiction that I mentioned earlier. He and his girlfriend Annie are home visiting. I should have said earlier that, as Brent mentioned, most of the novel takes place in Las Vegas. Nick actually lives in San Francisco, but he comes home to visit his mom constantly in Las Vegas to take care of her and see how she's doing. And so in this story, he and Annie are visiting, and his mom is kind of right in the middle of this really terrible addiction, and he's home to try to take care of her in some way. This life or the next. They found his mother asleep on the couch, a box of sugar propped between her knees. One end of its top had been lifted open, peeled back like a length of bark, and the lap of her pink silk robe held a dusting of spilled crystals that caught the light of an end-table lamp. She was slouched and snoring, head tilted to the side. In a corner of the room, the local news murmured from the television. At her slippered feet stood a second open box. Nick looked at Annie, who studied his mother with a raised eyebrow. It was Valentine's Day, and they had just returned from a late dinner downtown. "Mom," he said, placing a hand on his mother's shoulder, shaking it gently. On the cushion next to her was a heart-shaped greeting card. It lay closed, face down, but he knew it was from his father. She still had every card Nick's father had ever given her, stacked neatly in her nightstand drawer. "Mom," Nick repeated, and her eyes fluttered open. She gave a start, drawing her legs together, kicking over the box at her feet. Nick bent down and picked it up. It was identical to the one between her knees, yellow and white, the brand name, Domino, printed in a cartoonish script, electric blue letters that ballooned diagonally across the cardboard. The box was empty, and its mere weightlessness made it seem as though he were holding a stage prop, something at any rate meant to appear heavier than it was. To his right, Annie remained silent. They had been in Las Vegas since Friday, staying in Nick's old bedroom. This was the first either of them had seen of the sugar. Not for lack of trying. Nick, in secret, had searched cupboards, closets, drawers. He had looked behind furniture, beneath her bed, in the trunk of her car, certain his mother had stowed it all away. "Jesus," he said, "look at you." His mother stared at him, expressionless. "You're home early," she said. "It's almost 11, Nick said. He sat down in a corner of the coffee table. Wind shook the windows, whistling against the glass. On one of the sills stood a tall ceramic vase of wilted chrysanthemums. "You'll kill yourself," he told her. "Is this what you want?" His mother didn't answer. She smoothed her robe over her thighs, sweeping the sugar from her lap. She liked to drink it straight from the box, or eat it cube by cube. At first, in the months directly following his father's death, eating sweets had been her comfort, a means, she had said, of alleviating grief. She would sit in front of the television and indulge herself, just as she had tonight, and before long she would forget, if only temporarily, the new circumstances of her life. But the candy and pastries his mother had gluttonously consumed were no longer enough. Cane sugar was all she wanted. She often ate 3 or 4 pounds a day, sometimes nothing else. Her cravings, she had told him, were uncontrollable, and Nick had simply to look at her for proof. Over the past couple of years, his mother had put on more than 100 pounds. Her face was plump, shaped vaguely like an eggplant, her back broad and pillowy. Loose skin hung from her arms, dimpled around the elbows, and at her waistline was a thick outgrowth of fat. "Hi, Mrs. Danzy," Annie ventured, fingering the long string of pearls that hung around her neck. She wore a sable shift and matching heels, and suspended from her shoulder was a red leather purse the size of a small camera bag, her hair trained into a girlish pigtail that sprouted like a pom-pom from the back of her head. They had met before when his mother had visited him in San Francisco, but this was Annie's first trip to Las Vegas. Nick likes to remind me that I have a problem, his mother said with a smile, the other box between her knees. I'm sure he's filled you in. I thought we made a little progress, Nick said. He searched his mother's face for some sign of contrition, but found nothing. Not so, I guess. Where, he wondered, had she hidden the 2 boxes? I'll leave you both alone, said Annie. No, he told her. You're fine, hon. They'd eaten dinner at a new restaurant she'd seen profiled in the travel section of the Chronicle, an expensive, scantily decorated place a couple of miles from the Strip. And as Nick had looked around at the other patrons, most of whom had worn pink or red or some integration of the two, he realized with a warm wave of pride that Annie was the most appealing woman in the room, with her blonde hair and blue eyes and small, lapidary features. Nick couldn't believe that he wasn't attracted to her, that in the 7 years they had been together he had never fallen in love with her, that he cheated on her with such fiendish regularity. He hadn't wanted Annie to come with him to Las Vegas, but she had pressed him, claiming he needed her for emotional support, and Nick had given in. In recent years he had let pass, gutlessly he thought, numerous opportunities to end their relationship. That she was here at his side only confirmed her place in his life, and he felt the stale disenchantment flow through him, his sense of himself as a coward. You look beautiful tonight, Annie, his mother said. She rubbed her eyes. Her robe, as she shifted on the couch, strained to cover her bulging stomach. Can I get you something to drink? Some tea, maybe? Oh, I'm fine, Annie said, but thank you. We don't want anything to drink, Mom. I wasn't talking to you, his mother said. She scratched the tip of her nose, brushing from her forehead a dark mass of hair. It fell from her head in strands of black and gray. She had neglected it over the past year, failing to have it dyed its usual sandy blonde, failing to have it cut, its lengthening seeming to keep pace with the steady expansion of her waistline. Nick got up, walked around the coffee table, and sat back down. Don't you have anything to say for yourself, he said, plucking the box from between his mother's knees. It, too, was empty. I need it, his mother said. Is this what you have to hear? It takes the edge off, Nicky. Better than those damn pills I was on. It was true, then, that she had stopped taking her medication. Since Friday, he had been waiting for the right moment to ask her about it, as she always grew snappish when he probed. Every so often, he checked with his mother's pharmacy, phoning long distance to make sure she was picking up her prescriptions, Zoloft and Deseron. And the last time Nick had done so, he had been told that her most recent refill remained uncollected. This was the reason he and Annie had come. He had figured February was as good a time as any to make a trip home, telling his mother that Annie wanted to get away for the holiday and had always wished to visit Las Vegas. You weren't supposed to be off those pills, he said now, sounding defeated, he thought. He couldn't help feeling responsible, guilty really, for the shape his mother was in. He should have moved back home a long time ago. Although he visited often, his absence, he knew, was somehow related to her worsening condition. He hated the weary, pitiless side of himself that grew aggravated with her like this, even though his aggravation was born only of concern. For some time now, he had been acting more like a warden than a son, stern and watchful, intolerant of her weakness, distant in the main, keeping their relationship intact, and he feared what might happen were he ever to move back to Las Vegas, that in becoming his mother's keeper he would grow to resent her, and she him. He considered how liberating it would be to leave her to her own devices, however guilty he might later feel. What about your therapist? Nick set the 2 empty boxes on the coffee table, sighing. A foul odor wafted from the chrysanthemums, their petals flagging against their stems. I assume you're still seeing her, at least. You look just like him, his mother said. Sitting like that, I mean. You've got your father's posture. Don't do that, Nick told her. Don't bring him up to change the subject. Nick, said Annie. He's on my mind, his mother said. There were framed photographs of his father everywhere he looked, on the tables and walls, the shelves, the mantel above the fireplace. His mother hadn't stopped wearing her wedding ring, a gold band that held a brilliant Asher-cut diamond, and was convinced that his father communicated with her, obliquely, like God, via the flickering of street lamps, the warbling of birds. You need to stop thinking about Dad and start thinking about your life, Nick said. Immediately, he regretted saying it. I'm going to bed now, his mother said sharply, if we're done here. She got up from the couch, slipping the greeting card into a pocket of her robe. It's nice to have you with us, Annie. I'm sorry you have to be a part of this. Nick walked to a window, peered through the open curtains. It had been cold and damp since they had arrived, mist swirling from a charcoal sky, and he watched as wind drove rain against a fan palm in the front yard. On the television, the news had ended and an infomercial had begun. A woman's voice describing the various benefits of a dietary supplement. Nick wished he had gotten his mother a gift for the holiday. She had declined his invitation to join them for dinner, handing him a key to the house, telling them to stay out as late as they wanted. And it pained him to think of her at home by herself on Valentine's Day, scarfing down sugar and staring at an old card from his father. Without his noticing, Annie had walked up beside him. She cleared her throat, threaded her fingers through his. "I'm trying to save your life," Nick said, turning from the window, but his mother had already left the room. I'm sorry that's not happier. I mean, I know Valentine's Day. So in the rest of this story, Nick ends up driving downtown the next day with Annie. She's always wanted to gamble in Las Vegas, so they go downtown and they play blackjack for a very long time at Caesar's Palace. And one of the things that really bothers Nick about Annie is the fact that she's not very frugal with money. She really just spends wildly and is in some kind of debt herself. And so she ends up placing $100 on a single round of roulette later in the scene, and she wins. And Nick is very frustrated that she's made this bet. So they're driving home, and he's kind of upset with her. And in this scene, she tells him that she's pregnant. And this is kind of a pivotal point in the book, of course, because he doesn't want to be with her. He's been with her for about 8 years at this point, and he's trying to figure out how to break up with her for good, and it turns out that she's pregnant. So essentially, he knows he's going to have to marry her at this point in the book. And so he's trying to come to terms with this. They end up getting in a very heated argument. And after she goes to sleep, he leaves the house late at night to look for more sugar in his mother's house. And he ends up finding a big store of it in her shed, about 27 boxes of Domino sugar. And he piles them all in a wheelbarrow, walks the sugar out to the desert, and starts pouring them out one by one onto the desert floor in the middle of the night. While he's doing this, an owl was kind of perched in a cactus nearby, and this owl, I guess, mistakes him for a predator. I say I guess, I wrote it, but I'm still not quite sure how the owl attacks him. I think he mistakes him for a predator. The owl attacks him, and Nick fights off this owl and kind of survives without a scratch. Goes back home to his house and finds his mother sitting up in the middle of the night herself, and she's taken down all the pictures of his father in the house. The walls are completely bare. So in about the half an hour that he's been gone, she's removed all these pictures. And in this conversation they end up having, his mother takes off her wedding ring and gives it to him and asks if he'll give it to Annie. And his mother doesn't know that Annie's pregnant or even that he's considering marrying her, but his mother really likes Annie and he wants them to get married. So she gives him the wedding ring, and then Nick goes back to the bedroom and kind of just squeezes it in his fist and doesn't actually give it to her that night, but ends up giving it to her later in the book. So the last piece I'll read is, I'm going to read this entire story. It's very short. It's only about 6 pages long. It's called Crash Site on a Desert Mountain Outside Las Vegas. And this is the last story in the book. So the book begins when Nick is 14, and then throughout the next 7 stories, it progresses till he's about age 40. And then the very last story, it goes back to when he's 14 again. So this story is in the first person, and this is between Nick and his father. It takes place in this mountain right outside Las Vegas, as the title suggests. Crash Site on a Desert Mountain outside Las Vegas. I was hiking with my father in the desert outside Las Vegas, up the eastern face of Mount Potosi, not far from where Carol Lombard had died in a plane crash more than 40 years ago. The trail cut through a dense landscape of cottonwoods and Apache plume, past limestone cliffs and steep, rocky hillsides, winding along the belly of a shallow canyon that ran like a scar up the front of the mountain. Sunlight speared through the branches as we took turns swinging from my father's canteen, an old stainless steel one he'd had since his years in the Army. Warm today, he said, and when he turned around, it looked like he was crying. What appeared to be tears were only drops of sweat, running from his forehead into the corners of his eyes, spilling down his cheeks. It occurred to me that I had seen my father cry only once, when we were wrestling in the living room for a few weeks before, and I elbowed him in the nose, breaking the lenses of his glasses, blood pouring from his nostrils, his eyes watering. He hadn't cried at my grandfather's burial, and he hadn't cried the day I watched him shred his ankle with a hedge trimmer in our backyard. And according to my mother, my father hadn't cried the morning I was born, even though he told her I was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen in this world. For a long time, I had assumed that only children were allowed to cry. Children and women, maybe, because my mother cried all the time. "Thank God for this shade," my father said, coughing into his fist, gasping as he wiped the sweat from his face. He pawed through a low tangle of branches, and we emerged into a clearing where a camouflage hunting cap lay in the shade of a yucca. "Looks like somebody lost this," he said. The cap was faded and worn, its bill creased down the middle. He picked it up, dusted it off, set it down on the spiny limb of a fallen Joshua tree. My father was the sort of man who didn't mind going out of his way to return a lost wallet to its rightful owner. "What if it belongs to someone who lives out here?" I said. "A homeless person or a runaway, living in a box in the desert." My father cocked his head the way he did when he was pretending to consider something he knew was unlikely. I had never seen any homeless in the desert, but exploring the narrow trails that twisted through the chollas behind our house, I often came across the remnants of what I assumed were their drunken overnights: cigarette butts, broken whiskey bottles, tattered sheets, and old brown shoes. Every now and then a soiled condom or a faded copy of Penthouse. And it was rumored that somewhere deep in the Mojave was an entire community of freight hoppers and gypsies and other itinerants who came and went on a secret road and slept in shanties made of acatillo branches and aluminum cans. "I wouldn't mind living on this mountain," I said. "I'd drink water from a cactus if I got thirsty. I'd eat snakes and lizards. I'd do whatever I wanted." It had been only a few months since my father had received his diagnosis. I still had trouble remembering the official name of the disease: idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. Words that, whenever my mother said them, seemed to describe something exotic but innocuous that might resemble a double helix when sketched on a blackboard, not the debilitating illness that was to take my father's life in the next several years. He wasn't supposed to be hiking up mountains, even in the fair weather of autumn, but he insisted on remaining active, rolling his eyes when my mother pleaded with him to rest. He regarded his condition as though it were a rumor. At night in my bed, I tried my best not to cry, entertaining fantasies of running away from home, living by myself on the streets or in the desert. I was 14 and didn't know much about anything. "Not every cactus holds enough water to drink," my father said. "You'd die out here, believe me." It was rare that he was wrong about something, and his new voice, dry and wispy from the coughing fits that reddened his forehead and purpled his lips, was at odds with my impression of him as a figure of authority. People seemed to respect my father, talking kindly of him when he wasn't around. The only person I had ever seen challenge him was my mother, who sometimes spoke to him as if he were a child. Lately, though, ever since he had been diagnosed, failing to cry even then, she had been nothing but affectionate toward him, holding his hand in public, resting her head on his shoulder while they watched television in the evenings. My father nudged the hunting cap at the toe of his boot, sliding the canteen into his backpack. "Shall we?" he said. "Let's try and find that crash site," I said. He checked the trail guide, gasping again, breathing heavily. "We're pretty close, I think." We had been hiking for over an hour, and I knew he was exhausted. I wasn't sure he could go much farther, but I was young and thoughtless, and I wanted to see where the plane had gone down. I wanted to see where the movie star had died. Half an hour later, we reached the site. It was a DC-3 that had exploded into the mountainside, sending a roiling cloud of fire into the dark winter sky, January 16, 1942. I had read about the crash in the trail guide during the drive from the city, heading west in my father's new Buick LeSabre. In addition to Carol Lombard, the plane had been carrying her mother, 15 soldiers, and an MGM publicist named Otto Winkler. "This is it," my father said. The larger sections of the plane, what had remained of the body and the wings, had been removed a long time ago, but the area was strewn with rubber hoses, twisted wire, shards of glass, and bits of crushed aluminum. We saw rusted safety pins, molten buttons shining like obsidian in the warm noon light. What looked like part of an engine had become one with the mountain, a corroded, doily-shaped thing lodged in a sheet of rock. Everywhere the dirt was pitted with holes, dug, my father said, by treasure hunters looking for Carol Lombard's wedding ring. Clark Gable, her husband at the time of her death, had offered a reward for it, but her left hand had never been found. "Look at all this stuff," I said. "Don't touch anything," my father told me. His eyes slitted against the sun. "Leave everything exactly the way it is. This is sacred ground, Nick." It was eerily silent. A high saddle of rock hung above us, and all around were big green century plants, growing in clusters beneath a blue umbrella of sky. For several moments, neither of us said a word. It dawned on me that this might be our final hiking trip together, but it seems to me now that I was unwilling to believe it. My father sat in a pile of white talus rock, staring at the site in a mournful sort of way, as though it had been his own friends or relatives who had perished in the crash. I loved him, of course. The thought of his eventual disappearance from my life gave me a feeling of being chased, made my heart race, my breath quicken. I knew that he loved me too. I was his son, his only child, and that I weighed heavily on his mind when he considered the probability of his untimely death. He kept sitting there, kept staring. Something had come over him, I could tell. I could have said any number of things to my father then, but there was a self-centered, irrational part of me that hated him for being sick. A part of me that wanted to make him cry again, the way I had in our living room a few weeks before. And so I told him, in that strange pocket of silence, the worst thing I could think of, that I wouldn't miss him when he was gone. The words slipped heedlessly from my mouth, completely unwarranted, unrelated to anything we had been talking about. Untrue. What? My father said. What did you just say? I pictured my mother as a widow, draped in black, and then I thought back to the hunting camp we had come upon, trying to imagine what life might be like out here, alone on a desert mountain. Anger churned inside me. Why would you say that, Nick? Why would you say that, Nick? My father said. He looked at me, his face hardened. Why would you tell me something like that? He asked. But I didn't answer him. I had no idea. Sure enough, he began to cry, lowering his head, pressing his hand over his mouth. For a moment, he looked as if he were in great physical pain. It was nothing I wanted to see. I knew I had to apologize, but I couldn't speak. I couldn't even cry. I just stood there, ashamed of what I had done, wondering who I was and who I might become. Thank you. If there are any questions at all about the book, I'd be happy to answer them. Brett?
Can I get us started? I'm curious how you feel about Nick, the character, and whether your feelings about him changed over the course of writing the stories.
Yeah, I gotta be honest, I kind of hate him now because it took me about 8 years off and on to write this book, which I'm embarrassed to admit because it's only about 200 pages long. But I worked on it for a couple of years, and then I put it aside and started a new book and put that one aside and came back to it. So it was kind of off and on for almost a decade, and honestly, I am so tired of this guy. He was just so much a part of my life when I was writing the book. But yeah, I think my feelings for him did evolve significantly by the end. When I first started writing the book, I really thought of him as just kind of just kind of a cad, and not a really sensitive guy at all. I had initially conceived of him as this guy that was just kind of intrinsically unlikable, and there was really no redeeming quality about him at all. And then when the book started evolving, I realized I can't really write an entire book about this despicable character. So, and he also didn't seem very human to me. So I really wanted to humanize him. I wanted to make him a little bit more likable. And in doing that, in making him a more sensitive and compassionate character, I came to like him a lot more. And that actually made the writing process a lot easier because I came to I wouldn't say identify with him, but I came to understand him in a way that I didn't when I first started writing the character. So the latter half of the book went much more quickly because of that.
Did you write it in order, or did you? So you wrote it in order. I mean, because it's broken up. You know what I mean?
Yeah. No. I didn't write it in order. I wrote the middle story first, and let's see. I wrote. I wrote it completely out of order. Yeah. You know what I ended up doing was when I had about 4 or 5 stories. That's when the arc of the book kind of started to take shape. And so I asked myself, what needed to come before these 4 or 5, and what needs to come after them now? Because they were really kind of making up this middle arc. And so then I went back and I wrote the first 2 stories after that, and then the last 2. But yeah, and then I actually ended up, when I had all 9 stories, I ended up kind of juggling them a lot and really playing around with the orders significantly for about 5-6 months before I became really comfortable with it. And really, before I even narrowed it down to those 9, I had about 14 stories. And that was really kind of unwieldy. A few of them weren't very good. A few of them didn't really fit with the overall narrative arc, so I cut those and ended up with the 9 that I have now. But yeah, no, I didn't write them in order. I decided when I was writing the book that when I was writing each story, I did not want to think about the overall arc of the book. I wanted to think only about that story. And I didn't want to put any pressure on myself to kind of abide by any chronology or even think about any chronology. I thought that if I did that, then each story would not be as good as it can be as a kind of a separate autonomous thing. And so I just focused on each story separately. And and only when I was finished did I really kind of start tweaking them, playing with beginnings and endings to make them cohere as chapters.
Several of the stories deal with Nick's, I guess, development as a sexually active teenager and young adult. And I was wondering,
This stuff's pretty G-rated tonight.
yeah, the scenes are, for depicting lurid subject material, written very tastefully. And I was wondering, for people who do want to write about that aspect of the human experience, how to write about the modest things modestly.
Yeah, well, I guess I don't consider the things that are in this book immodest. I wanted to write a book that was somewhat at odds with, I think, the relatively prudish culture that we live in. And I really wanted to get at what is essentially a psychological dysfunction that Nick suffers from. It's emotional as well, but it's primarily psychological. And I wanted to get at this idea that he's suffering. Even though he commits these various infidelities and he's morally reprehensible, I guess, for that reason. Really, he's suffering much the way an alcoholic suffers. So I didn't want to write the book thinking of his sexual activity as something that is immodest. I wanted to think about it as I was writing it as though it was relatively normal. In other words, anybody can suffer from this, just as anybody can suffer from cancer or alcoholism or any disease, right? And I think Nick essentially is, I guess you might call him, a bit of a sex addict at times in the book, and I think for that reason he is someone who suffers. He's not someone who necessarily willfully commits these acts. So I hope that helps. I mean, that's how I wanted to portray him. So I guess I wasn't thinking of the kind of fixations that he has as anything that's all that unusual. I think that we just, we tend in our culture to kind of label anything that's, that's kind of outside of the envelope, sexually speaking, as being unusual and being, immodest, as you put it. But I really feel pretty strongly that that's wrong, and that people who do suffer from the things he suffers from probably feel, very stigmatized by that. And I also, along this line, I really wanted to take very seriously the things he was doing. Some people have read the book and said, a lot of it is funny. I mean, he's engaging in this behavior that's so unusual that sometimes it's bizarrely humorous. But I didn't want to render it in a humorous or comic manner because I thought that would really it would undercut the power of it, or the power that I kind of wanted it to have, and it would make it seem silly. So I really tried to avoid that as well.
What was your rationale in changing point of view? There were different points of view, especially the story you're reading. Why you decided to change them from first person to third?
I didn't change them. I just wrote them that way. And the reason I did, again, was that I wanted to make each story as good as it could possibly be, so that it could be extracted from the book and read by itself, and really feel like a self-contained, successful, significant story in its own right. And to do that, I had to write them in both the first and third person, in both the present and past tense, only because usually when I'm working on a story, I'll just switch back and forth between first and third constantly in the composition process, and then switch back and forth between past and present to try to figure out what works for that particular narrative. And it just so happened that half the stories worked in the present tense and the other half worked in the past. Half worked in the first person, the other half worked in the third. I didn't really orchestrate it or calculate it in any way. Certain stories just called for the first and the present, others called for the third and the past, and yeah. And then when my agent was sending the book out a couple years ago, before it was published, all the responses we were getting back from publishers were saying, if this were all in the first person past tense, we could just publish it as a novel and it would be as simple as that. But I was really hesitant to change the book because I liked that it read as both a collection and a novel. I had actually modeled it after a few books that are similarly written. One is a book called Marion O'Neill by a guy named Justin Cronin. Another is a book called Send Me by a guy named Patrick Ryan. And these books are written in a similar fashion, and they work really well. Anyway, so that's kind of why I wrote the book the way I did, and I didn't want to change it. I wanted to keep it the way it was.
Oh, you kind of explained this in what you read, but why sugar? What like?
Oh, yeah.
How did you get drawn?
Yeah. So what happened was, and the friend I'm about to tell about would not mind my telling you this. When I was, I guess about 27 or 28, I went to this high school reunion at a hotel in Las Vegas, and when I was there, I ran into this girl that I hadn't seen for a good 10, 11 years since high school. And in high school, she was very, very tall and very thin. She was a basketball player. And when I ran into her 10 years later, she was excessively overweight and unrecognizable. I didn't recognize her at all when she walked up and said hi to me. And even after she introduced herself, I had a moment where I was completely stunned because it didn't look anything like her. And so we talked throughout the night. And at the end of the night, she admitted to me, soberly, that she was a sugar addict, and that she had fallen into the depths of this sugar addiction over the past several years. And it began where she was just eating sweets and candies and cupcakes and cookies all the time, and to deal with depression, essentially. And then what happened was it snowballed, and she started just drinking pure cane sugar straight from the box. And she told me that what she would do is she would buy tons and tons of sugar and then lock it in her backyard and she'd padlock the door. Even though she had the key or the combination or whatever, somehow that padlock prevented her from going out back and getting the sugar every night to drink it. And she would ration it and allow herself like 2 boxes a day, which is a lot. I mean, that's about 2 pounds of sugar a day. And so she had put on several hundred pounds eating all the sugar. She developed hypoglycemia, diabetes. She suffered from tooth decay, all of these maladies as a result. And so she told me this whole story, and it was of course horribly, horribly sad. And I went home later that night, and at this point in the writing process of this book, I was kind of struggling with that story I just read from, and I couldn't quite figure out what the conflict was going to be. And I just kept thinking, what an interesting conflict that would make. So of course I didn't want to steal her story. That would be an awful thing to do. But what I did was I called her the next day, and I said, I'm working on this book, and I really found your story moving and very interesting. And would it be insulting to you if I used that in a story? Essentially, would it be okay? Do I have your permission to do that? And she was very flattered, and she said, yeah, that'd be great. And so she actually started crying a little bit. She was incredibly flattered, and she thought it was, one of the biggest compliments she'd ever been paid. And I still felt really awkward and very, very bizarre about using the material because it was so sensitive. But she said I could use it, so I did. And then I thank her in the acknowledgments page. I have a little sentence in there about her. Her name's Jamie Enos, and she's a lovely person. And she actually gave me permission to talk about this in readers. Because I asked her, I said, if I have to talk about this publicly, is that okay with you? And she did say yes. And so she was very generous with this information and this kind of story of hers. And then she ended up really helping me research the story quite a lot. She sent me a lot of notes and a lot of information that I can look up to learn more about it before I wrote the piece. So that's where that idea came from. Any other questions?
Talk a little bit about how you got the book published, and did you find it challenging to do that with a protagonist that, an anti-hero? I know we have the Don Draper and Tony Sopranos, but did you find that you had a vision as far as first person, third person, talking about that? Did you find it hard to stick to your guns when you were getting recommendations, rejections? I mean, I guess talk about that experience when you got this published.
Yeah, no, I probably should not have stuck to my guns in retrospect. I didn't really turn down a few offers. I didn't get any offers from any of the houses my agent had sent it to, but there were editors that strongly suggested that they probably would have considered the book more if I made some changes, and I didn't want to. The thing about Nick as a protagonist is that, yeah, I think he probably did hinder me a little bit. A lot of the comments I did get back from publishing houses was that he was too unlikable. But what I really tried to do was create this unlikable character in the end who somehow the reader could come to sympathize with. And I wanted to kind of present that challenge for myself. Create this guy who's essentially despicable in a lot of ways, but again, he is suffering. And so, there is something in him that people can identify with. He is very human, I hope, by the end of the book. And I wanted people to somehow come to like him, even though he did all these morally reprehensible things, and he he essentially, on the surface, he seems kind of morally bankrupt. But I think that did hinder me a lot. I mean, a lot of editors said they wished he were more likable. They wished they could have kind of attached themselves to him a little more. I think that decision, though, had more to do with marketability than anything else. You know, I don't think it was a decision that they were making about the book based on the artistry of the book, or based on the character development, or based on its readability in any way. I think they just thought it wouldn't sell as well. So, yeah, I think it was an issue. And so you asked how I got it published. So what ended up happening was it got rejected by about 28 houses in New York, and then my agent and I just started sending a round of contests. So there are a lot of publishers in the United States that will offer these, these first book contests, and so I won this one, the Mary McCarthy Prize, and that's how the book got published. So, yeah. And I couldn't be happier. To be quite honest, the folks at Saravan are just phenomenal. They're just great. I've gotten so much individual attention there, and they've done a lot of money, a lot of great marketing, put a lot of money behind marketing, and that usually doesn't happen in a larger house. So I was really happy with what ended up happening. Any other questions? All right. Well, thanks a lot for coming. I really appreciate it.